The emergency meeting had already been called. Senior figures were preparing to enter. Confidential papers were arranged, and the palace expected a difficult but controlled discussion. Then Princess Anne reached a page she was never supposed to find remarkable. One name changed everything. Harry's private solicitor appeared inside the Crown files. Anne stopped reading, looked again, and made a decision that stunned the room. Nobody was going into that meeting until she knew exactly why that name was there. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne did not raise her voice. That was what made the moment feel so serious. She closed the folder with deliberate care, rested one hand over the disputed page, and looked toward the secretary waiting near the door. No one enters that room. The emergency meeting was meant to bring together the Princess Royal, King Charles, Prince William, and a tightly restricted group of senior advisors to settle a sensitive internal dispute involving communications linked to Harry and the Crown. The Crown, in this context, meant the official machinery of the monarchy, acting through the sovereign and his household, not simply the royal family as private individuals. Everyone understood the difference, because the material before them could affect both. Charles received the message only moments later. He had expected resistance, argument, perhaps even anger, but not cancellation. When the king reached Anne, he did not challenge her authority or demand that the meeting continue. He asked one question instead. Did Harry's solicitor appear once, or was the name threaded through the material? Anne opened the folder again, checked the references, and answered carefully. The monarch's expression changed at once. This was no stray contact buried in an irrelevant list. The solicitor appeared beside correspondence that had been gathered specifically for Crown consideration. William reacted differently. The prince wanted to know who had placed the material there, and whether Harry knew anything about it. Anne refused to jump ahead. She had already noticed something more disturbing than the name itself. One page carried a different internal routing notation, meaning a marking used by palace staff to show how a document moved through official channels. That small difference suggested part of the file might have entered the system through a separate path. Anne looked again at Charles, then at William, and understood the danger. Before anyone could decide who was responsible, they would have to confront years of broken trust between Harry, his father, his brother, and the palace structure surrounding them. The meeting had been stopped, but the real danger was only becoming visible, because behind that single legal name stood years of fractured trust that no palace file could contain. For Anne, this was not simply a paperwork problem. For Charles, it touched a son he had struggled to reach. For William, it reopened suspicions he believed had finally been contained. And for Harry, even from a distance, the appearance of his solicitor inside Crown material carried an uncomfortable implication. Somebody had allowed a private legal boundary to collide with the royal institution. The file mattered because every person connected to it already carried emotional scars into the room. Anne had spent years protecting lines other people sometimes treated as flexible. She could tolerate disagreement, even bitterness, but she reacted sharply when private family conflict, legal representation, and Crown procedure began to overlap. Crown procedure meant the formal process through which the monarch and his household handled official matters, separate from family conversations behind closed doors. That distinction mattered now because Charles wanted to prevent another rupture with Harry, while William feared confidential royal processes could become entangled with a relationship already weakened by mistrust. Charles sat alone after Anne brought him the folder. He did not open it at once. The king rested one hand on the cover and stared at it, as if the delay itself could protect him from what might be inside. His hesitation revealed the real fear, not simply that a solicitor had been named, but that his son might have been drawn into an official process without being told. When he finally turned the pages, several references immediately troubled him. William reacted with far less patience. The prince asked Anne whether Harry knew his solicitor's name was inside the material, and whether anyone had spoken to him before the documents were assembled. She refused to guess. Her answer frustrated him because he wanted a clean explanation, something that could separate mistake from intent. Anne warned him that the name alone proved nothing. What mattered was how it entered the file. Requested, volunteered, copied, or merely referenced. Charles looked closer and found something else. Several pages dealt with old communications, not current legal action. The discovery suggested the file had been built partly from earlier exchanges, dragging unresolved tensions back into the present at exactly the wrong moment. The monarch understood how dangerous that was. A historical message could look very different when stripped of the circumstances that produced it. Anne then remembered one earlier incident. Months before, a quiet request had been made for archived communications linked to a disputed family matter. At the time, it sounded narrow and harmless. Now, she saw it differently. To understand why Anne canceled everything, the family would have to return to the moment when a seemingly ordinary request quietly crossed a line. The crisis did not begin with Anne canceling a meeting. It began months earlier with a conversation so restrained that nobody recognized it as dangerous at the time. A request was made for old communications connected to Harry. The wording sounded procedural, the purpose sounded limited, but someone interpreted that request more broadly than intended, and from that moment, private correspondence began moving toward official hands. What looked harmless then would eventually put Harry's solicitor inside a Crown file. William remembered the argument. Palace officials had been reviewing historic correspondence, trying to establish who had spoken to whom and under what authority. Historic correspondence meant older letters, emails, or messages being examined to reconstruct what happened. The prince had warned Charles that reopening those exchanges could create more pain than clarity. The king disagreed. He believed a narrow review might prevent another misunderstanding from hardening into permanent suspicion. Anne had not been central to that work. Charles brought her closer only after he feared a family disagreement was beginning to take on an official life of its own. The monarch trusted his sister to recognize when process crossed into personal territory, and she accepted because the stakes were bigger than paperwork. Harry had always tried to keep personal communication separate from formal legal representation. That boundary mattered because a solicitor was not simply an advisor. The lawyer represented private legal interests that should not enter royal decision-making. Then came the moment everyone would later look back on. During a private conversation at Windsor, a senior royal aide asked a former Sussex staff member to identify any archived communications relevant to the dispute. Archived communications were stored past messages, kept for reference, rather than current action. The request sounded limited. The former employee later sent back a reference chain containing broader records, including correspondence that mentioned Harry's solicitor. Anne studied the surviving account and felt the danger sharpen. The original request had never asked for privileged legal material, meaning confidential communications protected within a lawyer-client relationship. Yet the response arrived bundled with other records, and nobody could immediately show that someone had stopped to separate what was relevant from what was sensitive. William's earlier warning suddenly sounded less cautious and more prophetic. Charles had wanted clarity, but the process designed to provide it may have created the confusion he feared. Anne closed the account and reached one conclusion. Either someone had been careless, or someone had deliberately allowed the collection to widen. She needed the person who authorized it in front of her. The past had supplied the spark. Now Anne was about to force the palace to answer who had carried it into the room. Anne did not summon a committee. She called one man into a room and shut the door behind him. No formal opening, no soft language. The disputed file sat between them, already open to the page carrying Harry's solicitor's name. She tapped the margin once and asked who authorized its inclusion. The answer she received was careful, too careful, and as Anne listened, she realized the cancelled meeting might have prevented the royal family from walking directly into a far larger crisis. Anne kept her voice controlled as she questioned the senior aide responsible for coordinating the document review. The issue, she made clear, was not the solicitor himself. It was whether legal adjacent material had been allowed into a Crown process without proper scrutiny. A Crown process meant an official royal procedure prepared for consideration by the sovereign and his household. carrying far more weight than an ordinary family exchange. Charles deliberately remained outside the room at first, allowing his sister to trace the documents before emotion distorted the facts. Anne slid the file across the table and pointed to the unfamiliar routing notation. The aide reached toward the page, but she kept one hand firmly over it. He stopped. She asked who had cleared the material, and he said he believed approval had already taken place before the packet reached him. That answer hardened her expression. Nobody seemed willing to name the person who had actually decided the material was safe to include, and silence around responsibility was beginning to feel more dangerous than the original mistake. The aide finally explained how the documents had arrived. They had passed through an intermediary review, meaning another internal examination between the original source and the final Crown packet, rather than coming directly from Harry, his solicitor, or Charles. Anne immediately understood the significance. The assumption that Harry had somehow initiated the legal involvement was weakening by the second. The material had traveled through hands inside the system before anyone senior saw it. Then the aide admitted something worse. A covering note had been removed when the documents were condensed for the emergency meeting. A covering note was the short explanation attached to a group of records to clarify why they were being included. Without it, Harry's solicitor's name remained, while the context surrounding that name disappeared. Anne ordered the original packet recovered immediately. Before it could arrive, however, William learned who had possessed the authority to decide exactly what reached the king. The confrontation had cleared Harry of one assumption, but it created a more uncomfortable possibility. The decisive hand may have been inside the palace all along. Royal power is not always exercised by the person sitting at the head of the table. Sometimes it lies with whoever decides what reaches that table in the first place. As Anne traced the file's journey, the cancelled meeting began to look different. Charles had not ordered every document collected. William had not seen the complete packet. Harry had not personally supplied it. Somewhere between private correspondence and royal decision-making, somebody had shaped what the crown was about to consider. Anne understood exactly why that mattered. Gatekeepers inside the royal household could compile, shorten, classify, and route sensitive material before senior figures ever saw the original source. In simple terms, they controlled the path information took before reaching the monarch. Charles still held the final authority, but his judgment depended on one thing above all: context. If the origin of a document was unclear or an explanation had been removed, even the king could be pushed toward a conclusion built on incomplete facts. Charles finally opened the disputed pages himself. He read several lines, stopped, and set his glasses carefully on the table. Then he looked at Anne and admitted that he would never have allowed the emergency meeting to proceed if he had understood the file's full provenance. Provenance meant the documented history of where material came from and how it reached official hands. The monarch was not angry at his sister for canceling the meeting. He was disturbed that she had been forced to do it. William carried a different burden. The prince had immediately wondered whether Harry knew his solicitor's name was inside the file, and now that instinct embarrassed him. He had allowed years of conflict to fill a gap before the evidence could. Anne did not accuse him, but she did not soften the lesson either. Suspicion had moved faster than proof, and that was exactly how family mistrust became institutional danger. Then the original covering note arrived. Its wording changed everything. The note explained that Harry's solicitor appeared only because archived correspondence referred to earlier legal contact. The lawyer had not submitted material for the current Crown review, and nothing in the recovered packet showed a secret intervention. Anne saw the deeper failure immediately. During preparation, the explanatory context had been removed while the sensitive name remained. A harmless reference had been transformed into something explosive simply because the reason for its presence had disappeared. Charles knew correcting the paperwork would not be enough. Harry now had to be told what had happened, and the king understood that message could not come from an anonymous official. The mystery inside the file was beginning to clear, but the emotional consequences were about to reach the one person who had not yet been in the room. Harry's first reaction was not fury. It was silence. When he learned that his private solicitor's name had appeared in documents prepared for a Crown emergency meeting, he did not immediately accuse anyone or demand retaliation. He asked how the name got there. Then he asked whether his father had seen it. That second question exposed the real wound. For Harry, the file was disturbing, but the possibility that Charles might have judged him through it was far more personal. Charles had already decided Harry needed to hear the truth before fragments of the story escaped elsewhere. The king made sure the message explained that Anne had halted the meeting because the context surrounding the file was unclear. A Crown review, in this case, meant an official examination of material prepared for senior royal consideration rather than a private family discussion. Harry was also told that nothing currently showed his solicitor had actively participated. The name had traveled through archived correspondence, former staff, and internal palace processing before reaching the disputed packet. Harry listened without interrupting. Then he walked away from the table, stayed silent for several moments, and returned with a question nobody around Charles wanted to hear. Had William believed he was behind it? The prince wanted to know whether his brother had assumed he had brought legal pressure into the royal process before anyone checked the evidence. That question reached the king quickly, and the monarch understood why it hurt. The mistake had reopened an older wound. Harry's fear that suspicion inside the family often arrived before conversation. Charles did not dismiss that fear. He knew William's first reaction had been to question whether Harry understood what his solicitor was doing, and the king could see how easily that instinct might confirm everything his younger son already believed. Harry then disclosed through the private conversation that his lawyer had previously advised him to keep certain personal communications separate from royal negotiations. Royal negotiations meant private discussions with the palace over family or institutional matters. That advice made the accidental crossover feel even more serious. Harry surprised everyone with what came next. He did not threaten legal action. Instead, he asked for the complete chain, showing how the solicitor's name had entered the Crown papers, from the archived message to the final meeting file. Anne supported the request immediately, because transparency was now the only credible answer. Charles understood that documents alone would never repair the damage. He told Anne that Harry and William needed to speak directly, without advisors, lawyers, or courtiers between them. A file had created the crisis, but only a conversation could decide whether it ended as another betrayal or something unexpectedly different. There were no folders on the table this time, no private secretaries, no legal advisors, no carefully prepared summaries explaining what either brother was supposed to think. William and Harry were left with something far more difficult: each other. The conversation began awkwardly, with the disputed Crown file hanging invisibly between them. Then William said what Harry had not expected to hear. He admitted that when he first heard about the solicitor, he had assumed the worst, and that assumption had been unfair. William knew Charles and Anne had removed every institutional buffer on purpose. The king and his sister wanted the brothers to deal only with what had happened around the file, not reopen every wound between them. An institutional buffer meant the aides, lawyers, and officials who normally carried messages or softened difficult exchanges before they reached senior royals. This time, none of them were present. The prince explained that the cancelled meeting had been intended to settle a family-related communication dispute, not to build a case against Harry or draw his legal representatives into royal decision-making. Harry did not accept that explanation immediately. He told his brother that seeing his solicitor's name inside the Crown material had been disturbing, but discovering William's first instinct had been suspicion hurt more. The Duke said the problem was not one mistaken assumption. It was what that assumption represented after years of distance. He wanted to know whether his brother had truly believed he would quietly bring legal pressure into a family process without warning anyone. William paused before answering. Then the future king refused to defend himself. He admitted that years of conflict had trained both brothers to interpret missing information as danger. The prince had seen an unexplained legal name and filled the gap with distrust. Harry listened, still guarded, but the admission changed the tone because his brother was no longer arguing about intent. He was accepting responsibility for his reaction. Harry then confirmed the crucial fact directly during their private conversation. He had never asked his solicitor to contact the Crown about the review, and he had never authorized legal material to enter the palace process. William answered with something equally important. Anne had cancelled the emergency meeting before any decision was taken. No formal royal judgment had been made using the misleading file, meaning the misunderstanding had been stopped before it could become policy or punishment. The brothers did not repair everything. They did, however, agree that silence would now make matters worse. William and Harry both wanted the palace to explain publicly why the meeting had been stopped before speculation created a story neither of them could control. For once, the private conversation ended with less anger than it began. But outside palace walls, the cancelled meeting had already become a public storm. By morning, the story no longer belonged only to the royal family. The cancellation of an emergency meeting, Anne's intervention, and Harry's solicitor appearing in Crown paperwork exploded into public view. But one detail transformed the reaction. The meeting had been stopped before any decision was taken. Suddenly, Anne was not being portrayed as the woman who caused a royal crisis. She was being viewed as the person who prevented incomplete information from becoming an irreversible family judgment. Anne watched the coverage without satisfaction. Palace communications had confirmed that the planned gathering was cancelled after questions arose about the sourcing and contextual presentation of material prepared for discussion. Palace communications meant the official statements and briefings used by the royal household to explain events without exposing private family exchanges. The wording was careful, but the meaning was clear. No decision concerning Harry had been made, and the disputed material was being corrected before any future royal consideration. Charles felt the pressure ease, but only slightly. The king had feared the story would become another brutal father versus son confrontation, yet public attention was shifting toward the process that had failed them both. That distinction mattered, because the monarch now faced something bigger than embarrassment. If people believed incomplete information could reach senior royals without its original context, confidence in how sensitive matters were handled would suffer. Anne understood that too. When an aide told her that commentators were praising her intervention, she answered quietly that the meeting should never have reached that stage. Then one headline changed the emotional temperature completely. A major London newspaper appeared with the words, "Anne stopped the room," dominating its front page, followed by an account explaining that she had cancelled the gathering after spotting an unexplained legal reference. Outside Buckingham Palace, visitors gathered around phones, reading the same words aloud and debating whether her refusal had prevented a family mistake from becoming an official royal judgment. For the first time since the crisis began, the public story was moving away from accusation and toward restraint. Broadcasters pushed the distinction even further. Harry's solicitor had been referenced inside archived correspondence, they explained, but nothing showed that the lawyer had secretly entered the current royal process. That clarification mattered because it separated an old legal reference from active involvement. Charles heard the framing and finally allowed himself a moment of relief, while Anne remained focused on what came next. The misunderstanding had been corrected publicly. The deeper choice had not. The headlines had exposed the failure. Now the king had to decide whether the palace would merely repair a file or learn from what nearly happened. In the end, the most important royal decision that day was not made inside the emergency meeting. It was Anne's refusal to let the meeting happen at all. One unexplained name had exposed how quickly incomplete information could harden old suspicions into new wounds. Charles had nearly entered a discussion without the whole context. William had briefly assumed Harry's involvement. Harry had discovered how vulnerable private boundaries remained. Stopping the room gave every one of them something rare, the chance to correct themselves first. Charles made the next decision quietly. The king would not reconvene the original emergency meeting in its previous form, and the disputed file would be withdrawn. Any future discussion had to separate verified facts from private legal references and historic correspondence. A crown file, an official packet prepared for senior royal consideration, could shape decisions with lasting consequences. Anne's intervention was therefore remembered not as defiance, but as protection against judgment built on incomplete material. Charles later thanked his sister in private. He did not make a speech, and Anne did not invite one. The monarch acknowledged that she had stopped something he might otherwise have allowed to proceed. She answered with a warning. Families become most dangerous to themselves when assumptions begin passing as evidence. Her words mattered because the crisis had proved exactly that. A missing explanation had nearly turned old correspondence into a fresh accusation. William returned to Charles with a harder admission. The prince said his conversation with Harry had not repaired every wound between them, but it had forced him to see how deeply distrust had shaped his reactions. The king accepted that as progress and did not demand reconciliation. Harry, meanwhile, received the completed account showing that his solicitor's name had entered the crown material through archived correspondence, not through any covert intervention. He accepted the clarification and chose not to pursue the matter further. The palace tightened its handling of sensitive family communications after that. Legal references could no longer be separated from their sourcing context before reaching senior royals. Anne had prevented administrative carelessness from becoming personal betrayal. Charles learned that authority depended on complete information. William confronted his instinct to distrust. Harry saw that, this time, someone inside the institution had stopped the machinery before it judged him unfairly. And that was the final significance of Anne's decision. The meeting that never happened became more important than any verdict it could have delivered, because stopping it gave a damaged family one rare victory over its own distrust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.